Okay, so you should see the little blurb we're going to record. So you're welcome to stay off camera if you'd like, and let me know in the chat if things you say you don't want to be publicized, all of that business. We try to be really respectful of people's perspectives. Okay, so Sarah, as I was saying, the reason I find this topic so interesting, or this political moment so interesting, is that I'm really, as a philosopher, intrigued by the intersection of ethics and epistemology. So what we value and what we know and how we know. And Sarah, as you know, and other philosophers, and Sterling, you probably know this too, just from the history of philosophy, those two things have historically been sort of disconnected, right? We tell, as philosophers, a story about what we value in one bucket over here. And that has to do with all kinds of things: social, cultural, interpersonal, religious, like all of those things about what we value. And then there's a separate kind of more empirical story about what we know. That's, what kind of questions, access do we have to the truth? What kind of tools are at our disposal to understand what's going on around us? And so we do epistemology over here and ethics over here. But I remember as a postdoc being introduced to the idea of epistemic and ethical coupling, the idea that we can't divorce what we know from what we value. And in fact, what we value informs what we know and maybe how we know. And that basic concept of the coupling of the ethical and the epistemic, I think was eye-opening to me when I first learned of it as a student, and as I think as a scholar now, really shapes my view of how we understand other people's perspectives. When we think in normative ethics, as a philosopher in normative ethics, we focus on ethical reasoning. We try to give students, and Sarah, you might have had these in classes, and I know, Sterling, you heard these from me, you hear basically the old dead white guys version of Western philosophy and normative ethics, where you've got like the Kant and the Hume and the Mill and the Wittgenstein and like whomever else tells a story, and the James, Sterling, that one's for you, about ethics, normative theory, like how we rationally deliberate to make a decision about right and wrong or good and bad. But the power of this coupling story is that it's not just reasoning that gets us to a decision about right and wrong or good or bad. It's also about what's going on around us. And so there's this intimate connection between what's happening in our social and political environments that shapes how we see things in the world, or maybe from what perspective we see things in the world, and therefore what and how we value. And for me, like whether it's House Bill 7 or some other legislation in Florida or elsewhere, or whether it's critical race theory and Governor DeSantis, or whether it's some other context, the idea that there are these sort of powerful figures, maybe in politics or technology or industry, that are shaping or directing conversations about what matters and why, is really a powerful idea. And if anybody is turned off or on, so Nancy and Jeff, you might be particularly interested in sort of House Bill 7 critical race theory, and we can address those specifically. But I was also thinking this is applicable to the conversations going on right now between Elon Musk / Twitter and Apple, for instance, right? These sort of Twitter fights and Twitter conversations. What's happening is these cultural conversations are being shaped by those in power. And that's shaping what we pay attention to ethically, and basically how we pay attention to it, what we know. So that's my context. And I'm happy to sort of talk through the podcast, or I will just shut up for a minute and let people ponder. And if you want to weigh in, feel free. Sterling, yeah, please don't stand on ceremony.
So when I was getting this master's in spirituality, culture, and health, and we're covering cultural competency. We addressed embrace diversity. Great, that sounded good. And inclusion, that sounds good. And then when I got to equity, and I'm glad we have two folks with the equity area here, I call it, inequity is kind of synonymous with diversity. Okay, you embrace diversity, you embrace inequities. Okay, and then we have this equitable movement. And I thought about it, and you're talking about power, and the gentleman in the podcast blatantly said that he's a black Marxist. And, that's one of the failing. So,
And if that weren't bad enough, he's also a philosopher, Sterling.
well, but I mean, really, if I thought about it, and I'm glad during the podcast they mentioned hierarchies. I mean, we wake up every morning and I have a hierarchy of what I'm going to do. And those things, the hierarchy changes throughout the day. But I think we have to be careful with equity, because at some point, I feel like you can never get a truly equitable society without authoritarian, totalitarian force. And you've just mentioned the different hierarchy of who has the power, and that in the podcast mentioned, Marxist and everything, and when they were looking for those regimes were really, Marx was trying to get an equitable system for the working class, to some degree, and so yeah, I think equity's good. I struggled with that. Embrace diversity, which to me would be embracing inequities to some degree, and then equity also kind of means leveling the playing field. Well, that takes an authoritarian power to level the playing field. So I think when they talk about equity and equality, I mean, obviously we've learned that those are not the same thing, but and equity is good, but I think we have to be careful about how much authoritarian. I don't, and I know you, Dr. Beaver, don't like submitting to authority. Yeah, you don't like people taking too much control. You like to have a lot of your freedoms. So I don't know. I think that's a very sensitive area when you talk about how you're going to achieve equity and how far you're going to push it, because hierarchies are going to constantly arise, and if you try to level, I mean, even if you have kids and one is sicker than the other, and you don't treat them with equality, you give more to the sicker. It's kind of the model for equity is leveling the playing field. It's not necessarily giving each the same share. So I'm careful with that, and I try to keep from getting in trouble by trying to make sense of it. But diversity, inclusion, great, but equity, I think, is a little bit touchy. A little bit. We got to get careful with equity. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sterling. And I'm happy to have folks respond just to Sterling directly, but I'll point out that I think, Sterling, I hear you mapping out an argument from the podcast. I think did a pretty good job of mapping out sort of arguments from two sides of this debate. And so we'll try to map those out, but I hear you doing that kind of same work. And what you're pointing to from my perspective is that the goal is this like muddy middle, that too much like with everything, if we push to the extreme in either direction, we run into problems. And this is true of like normative theory too. If you're strict utilitarian, you run into these weird problems, and if you're strict deontologist, you run into these weird problems. What we're shooting for then is something in the middle. But the closer you get to the middle, that is, if you don't take sort of a hard line stance on ethical reasoning or what matters and why, or how we know any of that stuff, if we let things be murky, which seems to be the way we live our lives normally, it's also really hard to pin stuff down. And so it seems like people have talked in the past about pendulum swings, right? That we swing one way for the sake of stability, and we realize there are problems, and so we start to swing back. And there's this period in the middle where it's kind of unclear what's going on, but it feels just, maybe more just. And then we swing too far in the other direction, and we run into some problems. And so it's this constant back and forth. Taiwo, the philosopher in the podcast, talks about this Fermi Taiwo also talks about this in the podcast. So we'll run through that in a second. Anybody else want to respond to Sterling or add in to the conversation?
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think the more equitable achieved equity, it's going to take more of an authoritarian, I don't want to say regime, but it takes more of an authoritarian society to achieve equity. And I don't know if we really want to get to that, how far we want to get to that point of authoritarian leadership. Yeah.
So you think there's like, are you saying, Sterling, or arguing that there's a like a necessary connection between what you're defining as equity and authoritarianism? That is,
I think
have equity without
exactly not
consolidation of power.
Exactly, or some sort of rule to equity, because hierarchies are going to be created at a constant, just constantly and all the time. Yeah.
So if we thrust this back into the ethics sphere, the moral sphere for a second, one of the questions that ethicists run into all the time is what direction are we headed in terms of moral change? In coming out of the, well, maybe let's just keep it as recent as we can, maybe post-World War II, we came into a globalized world that had developed this idea of moral progress, that there were certain things that happened, injustices, let's say, that were bad, and we were headed away from those. And there's this idea of progress. That's a little bit different than the pendulum story, which is the idea of maybe moral change. The story that I think, the story that came up in the podcast and the story that I think is at work in this conversation so far is not the moral progress story, but it's the moral change story, right? That particular values that we might hold as the right values at one time are disrupted, upended, in constant flux maybe. And that has a lot to do with lots of factors that I'm not qualified to talk about: cultural change, politics, economics, like all kinds of things outside of my wheelhouse, but also power, which is also outside my wheelhouse, but that's the focus of the podcast. That there are particular voices that can push that pendulum quicker, they change its momentum more swiftly. And this is how the podcast sort of set up the dialogue at the beginning. The podcaster set up the dialogue. He starts by saying there's that we live in kind of a reactionary moment, and he mentions that he's lived through several of these and gives you some examples. But then he basically offers, I tried to tease out two kind of critiques of those that lead to reactionary moments. He defines them as critiques from the left and the right, and part of that is just because of the orientation of the podcast. I don't think we need to put it necessarily in political terms, but one critique is that justice and equity and equality language have been weaponized or co-opted by the powerful to manipulate policy and resources in a form of what some business ethicists call the virtue signaling, right? That they're no longer doing the job they were designed to do. And he gives you a couple of examples of this we can talk through, but they're not doing the job they're designed to do. Instead, they've been picked up by those in power. And I know this is sounding now, I'm even starting to feel a little like conspiracy theory. It's not like there's some big brother out there in power, but power plays this role. So powerful individuals pick up concepts like this. These might be political figures or industry representatives, or the podcast gives you several examples of these. And then those concepts are used to signal a virtue position, even if really there's nothing underneath. I talk with graduate students here at UCF a lot about the concept of integrity as having that same kind of slipperiness to it, right? There's a sense in which we can fight to be full of integrity, but if we don't really have a clear idea of what that concept means, it can also be used to sort of signal goodness or ethical action without any sort of meat and potatoes underneath it. That's one side of that argument, sort of the weaponization of these concepts of equity, justice, inclusion. And on the other side is what the podcaster called the critique from the right, the critique of the idea of wokeness as derogatory, like an obsession with political correctness. the idea that we're using these concepts almost too much in a way that weakens them. And so there's these sort of two polar positions that the podcaster tries to lay out. And I'm not sure I'm doing them justice because they still feel a little slippery to me. And then that leads us, then is supposed to frame the idea of Dr. Taiwo's concept of elite capture, which is where I'll turn next.
What did you call it, Dr. Beamer? Elite?
The concept is from the podcast, from Dr. Taiwo's book, actually, is elite capture. And I'll just, maybe what I'll do is I'll just talk that through, if that's okay, in case folks hadn't had time to listen to the podcast. Or Sterling, it sounds like you heard it. Do you want to talk that through?
No, you go. Yeah, I was like you said, you were starting off here with the philosophical part. I was interested in the, I think he said, standpoint epistemology.
Right.
I was thinking, that's like, to me, that was like subjective. I turn everything to James. To me, that was like subjective empiricism. It would be I think a way that I would try to define it. Standpoint epistemology as subjective empiricism. What is real is what I've witnessed, and that sounded like, and it becomes a very pragmatic situation, which to some degree you described. You describing values. We act on our values and our knowledge. It's very pragmatic.
Right. So I think a lot. So this is good. Yeah. Well, let's go there first, and then we'll circle back around to elite capture, because standpoint epistemology, I think, maybe is at the heart of these conversations in Florida now and nationally about policy decisions. And it's a relatively young concept in epistemology, but the idea is it's not an ontological concept. So it's not that everybody's got their own view on what is, but everybody has a perspective from which they know, right? That we, like, you and I can't know the same fact about the world in the exact same way because you and I come from different perspectives. Those perspectives now, this is where standpoint epistemology gets a squidge bit murky to me, but the idea is that those are informed by, like, everything, right? They're informed by my religious and cultural background, my nationality, my perspective, how I view myself in terms of race and gender, how I view myself in terms of how I view others, everything, all of these sort of external constraints that make me who I am, this like rich interconnectedness with the world that makes me who I am, also shapes my perspective on what I know. So if you say, what is racial equity? And you ask everybody in this room or everybody on campus or everybody in the state, yeah, it's just, Charlie, you have to talk through the squirrel problem. Yeah, there is a bit of pragmatism in here. Yeah, I think that's right. Everybody's got a sense of that. And that's where power creeps in, I think. Now, what I'm doing here is reading into Dr. Taiwo's position. So keep that in mind. I'm reading into the podcast and trying to sort of explicate what's happening there. I don't know that I've got strong personal views here, nor should I, perhaps. But I think what Dr. Taiwo is saying is that if you take as a truth about the world, standpoint epistemology, which he says he does in the podcast, then that's the gate through which power creeps into the story about how values change. To make that a little more clear, because that seems too abstract to me. If I've got a view that, and now let's talk directly about House Bill 7 and its injunction and responses and all of that stuff. We had this piece of legislation passed, and it was passed largely, I mean, there's all kinds of stories you could tell about why, and we don't know anybody's internal mental states and intentions, but the law was passed, and there's sort of two perspectives on it. One, it helps shape the nature of dialogue at public institutions. That's the sort of pro side. And on the anti sides, it shuts down critical dialogue or academic freedom or intellectual freedom or free speech on the other side. Now, we're talking about the same piece of legislation, the same language, and there's all kinds of legal critiques that have been made now against that legislation. We'll talk about Mark Walker's injunction here in a second. But yeah, you've got this piece of legislation that's read two ways. And again, I can't tell you a story about the intention behind the legislation because I wasn't involved in its creation. I don't know the people who wrote it, any of that business. But those two perspectives are about the same thing. And what's happening, it seems to me, is that we're reading those from two epistemic and value-informed perspectives. And whether that law is, I'll just use normative language, right or wrong, in terms of its role in the state, comes down to basically a value decision. It also comes down to, I mean, it comes down to the law also. What happens with the piece of legislation inevitably is just a legal matter, but we're talking about things in terms of their ethical value here. So everybody, I haven't said anything about House Bill 7, but Nancy or Jeff, since you might be more expert here than I am, do you want to talk us through what that legislation is? And I don't mean to put you on the spot. You could say no. That's okay too.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to help out.
Okay.
Just briefly, essentially what the law provided was that employers and those in the education setting could not teach specific concepts, and they laid out 8 specific concepts, most of which related to race and ethnicity and things of that nature. And the litigation standpoint has been that has been attacked as unconstitutional and argued under First Amendment grounds that it is prohibited. And so the recent enjoining of that law was done on those grounds. So Judge Walker found that it was a viewpoint restriction, which is prohibited under the First Amendment. And so because of that and its overbroadness, which is another doctrine under the First Amendment, because of those reasons, the statute was unconstitutional and therefore enjoined, at least for the interim, while that litigation continues. So it's called a preliminary injunction. So it's done at the front end of litigation, and it's a pretty high threshold to meet to get an injunction of that nature. And so the judge found that threshold was met in this case. And so for the time being, that statute is currently enjoined because of constitutional issues.
Yeah, and the landscape is so complicated, Nancy and Jeff, as you both know, but there's lots of our peer institutions across the state have released messages at the provost level about that enjoining or that injunction, basically that law is not enforceable right now, but it could be in the future. And so everything is just feels like a hot mess, which is partly why this conversation isn't necessarily about House Bill 7, because who knows how that's going to end up, but it's about where those perspectives come from and how they're shaped. Yeah, if anybody wants to read you know what, I don't have the link to the injunction. I'll put the link to the bill in the chat here if anybody wants to read it later on. Walker's injunction is eloquently written for a legal brief, so you should read it if you can. It says some really interesting things and takes a pretty strong position. So to just read you one passage towards the end on 135 of that injunction, Judge Walker says, "One thing's crystal clear: both robust intellectual inquiry and democratic democracy require light to thrive. Our professors are critical to a healthy democracy, and the state of Florida's decision to choose which viewpoints are worthy of illumination and which must remain in the shadows has implications for us all." Now, I read that to you not because I agree or disagree with it necessarily, but because that is not a legal claim. Nancy did an excellent job of laying out the legal grounds for that injunction, but Walker's claim here is a value-based argument, right? So he's grounding his claims in a position he thinks is the right position. And again, this is a really interesting landscape to be working in. Right. So
I had a question. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, go Mikhail. I'm losing my
Oh no,
train.
I was trying to multitask and listen to you and read the transcript from the podcast and also look at the bill just because I'm not in Florida, but I am in Georgia. So there's similar sentiments in Georgia as in Florida on this particular topic. But well, in addition, what I was thinking of while you were describing it made me think of like other countries that have had civil upheavals due to similar the haves and have-nots, and they were limiting what professors and educators could say And I wonder if any of those people researched some of those scenarios from other countries about what happened with the professors. I'm going to call them the intellectuals, when they started infringing upon what they can and cannot teach, and how that influenced certain protests that grew into movements. I'm trying to be very careful about what I say just because of the where I'm at.
No, I hear you, and it's interesting. I will share that I talked with Dr. Kuber about this, because when I put this schedule together at the beginning of the year, I thought this would be a really interesting topic to engage. And then I thought, as House Bill 7 passed and was, sort of in discussion in the state here, I was thinking this is not a comfortable position to be in, Mikhail and others. I was thinking, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, right? If somebody says the wrong thing, it could be against the law, right? And it's a really interesting position to be in, to want to discuss what I think are really interesting ethical issues and feel worried about it. So I feel that position as a faculty member of freezing of dialogue and debate. But I think we don't have to worry about that now. You might have to worry about that, Mikhail and Georgia, but right now we're in an in-between zone. So I think we're okay. Part of the reason I wanted to talk about House Bill 7 is because I think it's a really nice, it brings up really interesting questions related to this idea of elite capture, which I know, Steve, you'd asked about, and I'll talk through in a minute. But again, not knowing anybody's intentions in the drafting or the passing of this legislation, it seems like there's sort of two possibilities for why it came about in the first place. One argument I've heard, and I'm sure others have heard too, is that maybe it's just politics, right? Maybe it's like legislative appeal to a specific demographic in support of like a next political campaign or something. That's one reason why laws like this might get passed. But it might also be maybe more deeply strategic than that. That what would happen if legislators, powerful people in the state, could co-opt a co-opted concept? So the critique, remember, of questions of racial equity in particular, the idea of justice and racial equity is sort of a co-opted concept by both the left and the right politically. And I can tell you that Dr. Taiwo talks about the history of that idea here. But what if that concept then is co-opted again for specific purposes? So it's now twice removed from its origins and sort of drives legislation. It's manipulated. That comes back to this idea that it might be sort of a form of virtue signaling. And for me, this all comes back around to, Sterling, to your idea of standpoint epistemology, or you're pointing out of standpoint epistemology. Like, how do we understand other people's perspectives in a way to reach a common ground and understanding? Part of the legislation and part of UCF's response to it, and part of the conversation and part of the job, I think, of centers like ours, is to foster dialogues, right? And fostering dialogues about ethics requires this idea that we perspective take, that you can understand where I'm coming from and I can understand where you're coming from, and we can sort of reach some sort of middle ground. But standpoint epistemology suggests your standpoint, your perspective is so particular that I don't really have access to it in any meaningful way. Like, I don't know what it's like to be you. This is an old philosophical problem now. And so there's this idea that maybe it's not possible, and maybe all we've got access to is sort of the traditionally pragmatic view. And Sterling, I'll stop there because I neglected to let you talk through the squirrel problem.
Oh, did you want me to go back to the squirrel? Did you want me to talk through the squirrel?
I mean, I could see a way in which it's relevant. So could you tell us the story and then make that connection?
So the squirrel problem is something that's fun to compare perspectives. And William James was the one that introduced me to the squirrel problem through his work. If y'all know William James, he was 1900s, did a lot of work around the 1900s. I believe he died in 1912 or 1914. Anyway, he said that he was in a camping group, and there's a bunch of people there, and he tells me, he says, well, there's a squirrel up in a tree. And, you know, when you see a squirrel in a tree, you approach the tree and you go around the tree and the squirrel keeps moving around the tree. He says you go around the tree trying to see the squirrel. Question is, do you ever go around the squirrel? And that's a perspective question. And the answer lies in whether you feel like traveling north, south, east, and west of the squirrel is going around it, or if you must be to the squirrel's left, behind it, and to the right of the squirrel, which you never are, because you're always in this position, but you are kind of orbiting the squirrel. My perspective is we go around the squirrel, but from my experience, most people say you never go around the squirrel. You're facing it all the time and never go around the squirrel. So that's the perspective. That's the squirrel perspective problem.
So I could see a connection. It's such a weird story. Every time I hear it, I'm sort of like, wait, what? But yeah, for James, this was a really powerful experience, I guess, right? Because it got him to think about
he
how
came back from a walk in the woods. When he came back to the walk, everybody's like up in arms, ready to. I mean, they were upset. They were arguing from different sides that,
yeah.
No, you go around the squirrel. No, you never do. So,
so not to force it, but it seems like there's an analogy back to our conversation here, in that the question is, do we just constantly orbit one another, or do some orbits have a bigger pull than others? Are some squirrels bigger than others, or something? I'm stretching a bit.
I don't know, but I mean, it's a fun argument for the perspectives. That's for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Did I say enough, or did you want me to expound on this?
No. I was
answer.
Yeah. I was hoping that you would help us make the connection, because I'm trying to think, like, how does the squirrel connect back to questions about
the idea is
how we
about
know.
perspective. The idea is it's a argument for perspectives. Yeah. So
one way to look at that squirrel story is that, in the way that James describes it, it's never the case that you and the squirrel have the same perspective, right? The squirrel can't say he's been around you, and you can't say you've been around the squirrel, and you both don't see the world in the same way. And the question is there a perspective from which you can answer the question? And for this is the power, I think, of pragmatism generally, not to go too far into normative territory, but the idea that there is no external objective perspective from which to say, nope, that's the right view, or this is the right view. And for James and the pragmatists, we come to those through dialogue, through discussion, which is functionally what we're doing in sessions like this. We're talking through these really complicated, very messy, not clear to lay out sorts of problems, and trying to sort of understand all its angles, all its perspectives.
Well, when we were talking about standpoint epistemology, and you were getting into details, I was thinking about, and I think is Jonathan Dancy, a philosopher, and I believe he concentrates on epistemology also, and he's a big proponent of moral particularism. Are you familiar with that? So that would be definitely standpoint epistemology, would be more, I believe, moral particularism. I saw him in an interview, and he was talking about, okay, breaking into a car. That's wrong. But what if, there's something in the car that is going to save somebody's life, and every little circumstance for him is a moral particular. So definitely from the individual standpoints, as you go through life, your moral decisions are, that's what he called it, moral particularism. I don't know if you've followed up on that much, but that's
yeah, the idea that we don't, moral particularism, as I understand it, is the view that we don't evaluate classes of things, we evaluate individuals. Yeah. And I think, yeah, Mikhail, you say there's a similar concept in fluid dynamics. That's interesting.
Yes, and the only reason I know I'm sorry, that was one of the worst classes I had was fluids. I had to get that out. But when he was describing the squirrel and the perspective, my bachelor's in mechanical engineering, so I had to take thermodynamics and fluids. And two of them was the perspective, like on a pump. And there's the rotating end of the pump. And so the fluid, there's two perspectives. One perspective is from a particle of the fluid flowing in the pump. The other perspective is on the impeller. And so based off of which perspective you get different results for fluid flow. And so that's what it reminded me of, like the perspective of going around the squirrel, or that's what it reminded me of, was those different perspectives where they really, they don't equate to one another, but based off of the perspective, you can get a certain set point of results, and based off this other perspective, you get a separate set point of results, and you use the results for whichever conditions that you want to get. So it was kind of interesting to hear that it actually has a real philosophical name.
Yeah, that's super interesting, Mikhail. Yeah, I think the idea that there are perspectives on things is fundamental. Now, I didn't know this, but fundamental maybe to fluid mechanics. It's fundamental to the physical view of the world, maybe the quantum physical view of the world. It's fundamental to the natural sciences. Biology has the same idea that the particular matters. There's biological theories that focus on individual perception of the world rather than species level perception, for instance. And this is a view from philosophy. So far, we've established that there are these deep-seated, complicated moral issues, and that there are rich perspectives on them. So the question of the podcast and the question of this session really is, why do some perspectives seem to matter so much more than others? And how does that work? That's the idea of elite capture. So Dr. Taiwo in the podcast, when he brings up this idea of elite capture, which is a neologism, so do with it what you will. It's a concept he comes up with in his book. It's been, the idea has been around for a long time. But I'll read you a passage, or quote you a passage here from the podcast. Taiwo says at one point, there are two kinds of things that make elite capture go. One of which is just inequality itself. The bigger the gap between elites and non-elites, the more society will disproportionately wrap itself around the interests and goals of elites. And the weaker the constraints on elites are, organizations and actions like regulation, like unions, things that organize non-elites and give them power, the weaker those things are, the more elite capture there is. So basically what Taiwo is describing in this passage is the role of, maybe let's call them checks and balances. The idea that there are perspectives in the world. So Taiwo agrees with the sort of set of thinking we've been doing in the last 45 minutes here, but then says, yeah, but it's not just everybody has a perspective and we all negotiate them. It's that there are some perspectives that take up a lot more space in the room. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. It's that taking up more space in the room shuts down other perspectives. And that puts a value bias, to put it back in ethics, in the ethics context, that puts a value bias in the conversation. And when there's value bias in the conversation, you can't be on equal footing as a conversant or a discussant anymore. And we live in a world, economically, maybe, or socially and culturally too, where that divide keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. A much bigger percentage of US Americans own a much bigger percentage of, much smaller percentage of Americans in the US own a much bigger percentage of wealth overall. And that's a trend that's continued my entire life. Doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And that's just an economic example. The same happens socially and politically. We see this with TikTok stars. We see this with Elon Musk and on Twitter now. We see this interpersonally at the level of the research lab, the faculty conversation, the way the institutions run. Now that's not surprising and really, frankly, not interesting, because that just seems to be the way of the world. The question is, should that be the way of the world, right? There's an ethical question in there. Like, what do you do when elite capture seems to have shaped the very nature of philosophical conversation in the case of House Bill 7, right? Or at least has the potential to. And this is where Taiwo, at least in the podcast, doesn't really talk us through these things, but just opens up the question that elite capture is a problem, or at least a real thing to think about, a philosophical problem in that sense. and that paying attention to it could give us more recourse to change in the world. So I'm really interested to see what happens with House Bill 7. So we've got this legal injunction, and there's lots of conversation on both sides, and it's shaping has potential to shape the nature of our institutions, in both academic and I think other institutions across the state too, and across multiple states, Mikhail, to your point.
Dr. Beaver, I may take us backward a little bit.
Oh yeah, please.
Because we've galloped through a lot of different topics. And I'm not going to articulate them all very well, but we talked about equity, equality, diversity. We didn't get into the semantics or the differences of those, but we then talked about polarizing forces that can, drive us either toward or away from equity, and that brought us to a discussion of viewpoints and values, and even knowledge, epistemology. And you pointed out that there's squirrel arguments, relativism, maybe even analogs in the physical world. We had fluid dynamics. There's in physics the Lamar frequency. Okay, that almost pushes you in this direction of, okay, well, everyone has a personal view, and I can't know your view, and yet they're all equally valid. And that seemed to be where we gave up. We seemed to say, okay, well, there's these different values, different views, and there's nothing wrong with them. They're all equally valid. The podcast takes us in the direction that those become problematic when there is capture. Is that right? It was, I forget what it was called, something capture, I forget, elite capture. The idea that it's not that these different values exist and that in and of itself is problematic. It's that one value carries greater voice in a society, or one viewpoint carries greater voice in the society. That's what I heard. Okay, so I would push us back and say, no, it's not just that that's the problem. We can have different viewpoints. We can say the world is round, the world is flat. They're not equal. I'm sorry. The earth is not flat. We also have had problems in society where people have said, vaccinations are harmful. And there's scientific evidence that proves otherwise. So I would say we maybe brush a lot of your philosophy, and we brush a lot of rationality, and we brush a lot of good discussion under the carpet when we buy into the topic of the podcast and just jump from the relativism and saying, okay, having a bunch of different viewpoints is fine. It's not that they in and of themselves are bad. The problem is elite capture. I would disagree. I would say, fundamentally, there are some beliefs, there are some things which are just wrong, right? There are facts that are wrong. We can both be in the same world, the squirrel and I, right? And we both have our different viewpoints, but we're in the same world and we share the same tree, and there's reference points, and that's where we begin to develop information. And we can even have systems of knowledge. As a chemist, person doing optics, I recognize that we can have systems of knowledge where our viewpoints will matter, and yet it's the same knowledge. We can talk about, the direction something points in three-dimensional space, a vector, and then depending upon how you look at it, you get a different projection. The classic example is take the hand and look at it at different angles. Here it looks wide and you see 5 fingers. Here you look at it and you just see the thinness of my hand. Maybe it's 1 finger. This is a classic problem in X-ray diffractometry. And I know understanding those perspectives from the standpoint of knowledge and epistemology is important, because of very famous people studied that and figured out if you understand these different viewpoints, you can figure out the structure of DNA and X-ray crystallography. So I think it behooves us to recognize that, yes, we have relative viewpoints, but that's not the end of the story. There is fundamental knowledge that we need to come at. We need to wrangle with the different viewpoints and really try to get to an absolute truth. And beyond that, we should recognize that when there are these different viewpoints, particularly if we have elite capture and it's the wrong viewpoint based on something, then we're really in trouble. So I'm not really very comfortable just going down the road of saying, okay, it's a free-for-all, we can all have different viewpoints. We should have different viewpoints. What we should understand perhaps, and here I go off the podcast, is understand that with the freedom of a viewpoint comes responsibility. You have to have not just the opportunity to articulate the viewpoint, but you have to have the self-sustained, the self-carried sense of responsibility of being able to articulate what your viewpoint, where's the truth in it? What perspective does it come from? There's many ways in which a perspective can be valid, but only then can you try to share that viewpoint and, be part of that elite capture, if you will, that says, hey, my viewpoint is good. Here's why you need to think that way. And I think in all of these discussions, they're interesting. This one included. Discussions around House Bill 7 are interesting. Discussions in politics are interesting, but there's a number of problems. One, we don't establish the semantics and the definitions and understanding sometimes the difference between equality and equity or whatever. Two, we play loose with the rules. Once we get those definitions established, we veer away from them and don't recognize the value of the knowledge base that they bring and framing of the argument. So we just end up running around the tree with the squirrel and don't see the fact that there's absolute knowledge. And lastly, we don't understand the inherent responsibility that we have when we put out a viewpoint. And, that's one of the things that attracted me to academia, because I think we see that responsibility and we see how important it is when we discuss concepts to bring all of those viewpoints in and then say, okay, where does that perspective come from? How do you think about it? Is it cultural? Is it historical? What information, knowledge, or experience is it based on? And then what do we do with that? Where probably the only given is there's got to be some greater good that we pursue to achieve that. Right. And so the perspective I'm coming from this is that so many of these discussions and podcasts and arguments won't wrestle with the viewpoint that there is important knowledge to be had. And there's a fundamental responsibility in espousing any of those viewpoints. So I guess responsibility is maybe a last direction I would hope we would go in this discussion and others in thinking about these issues.
Thanks,
I
Dr.
sucked the air out of
Simmons.
the room, didn't I? I'm sorry.
No, that's really well said.
That was very good.
That's the last step, right? So we've got around to, there are perspectives. Some perspectives take up more space in the room than others. And the third step is, what if those perspectives are wrong? And the wrongness of perspectives comes back to this sort of ethical epistemic coupling. A great example of this, to me at least, is Elon Musk on Twitter. So here's this very powerful, incredibly wealthy person who spent $44 billion buying the social media platform, has a tremendous voice, a tremendous amount of space in the room. And he's prioritizing, he says he's prioritizing a specific value. So something like intellectual freedom or free speech. But what he's promulgating, what he's ignoring is responsibility. What he's promulgating is misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories. He's allowing those things under the guise of free speech to take space in the room. And he's doing it via social media, where he's got a tremendous amount of influence, elite capture, I guess Taiwo would say. So yeah, would we feel better if some moral exemplar had spent $44 billion on Twitter and was espousing only stuff we took to be morally good? This is where I think you're right, Dr. Killer, the podcast is kind of up in the air though, because it's almost like Taiwo is committed to the view that elite capture is elite capture, right? That the concept would apply if it were, I don't know who, Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, buying Twitter versus Elon Musk. That there's a sense in which nobody should have that much power, that much influence, that much space in the room. But your sense is responsibility matters a great deal, right? If you recognize what you're doing with that power, whatever your values might be, maybe that's where the space is.
Yes and no, if that was a question to me. It's not just putting the responsibility on Elon Musk. It's too easy to, point at the guy with all the power and say you're misusing it. And when I speak about responsibility, I probably also think about individual responsibility. So maybe I want to go do a podcast that is the counter argument on elite surrender. So you can identify Elon Musk, maybe, or not you, but one could identify Elon Musk as the bad guy in this scenario, as guilty of elite capture. But what about all of us who retweet something without thinking about the factual veracity of it, the source of the information, where it comes from, and how we are enablers? And so I would talk about the personal responsibility that we all have in a society to, not enable elite capture or at least the bad parts of it, right? You posited if it's Mr. Rogers, maybe a little elite capture is not a bad thing. Okay, I'll grant you that. He was cool. But it's where it's abused power that the elite capture paradigm is bad, is malicious. But it's enabled. It's enabled by elite surrender. It's enabled by people not assuming the responsibility that they have in using these tools. It's enabled by not having these kinds of discussions. It's enabled by not recognizing that when you have a viewpoint, it's not just relativity matters. You need to understand and voice where your viewpoint and belief systems and observations and conclusions come from, whether it's historical or cultural or whatever. And we need to be willing to engage in a little bit of vulnerability and recognize that, hey, in my culture in Louisiana, it may be weird that we have rice for every meal. Judge me if you want, but we love it that way. And similarly, it's okay to say that's the way we grew up, because guess what? Rice grows well in a swamp. So no, we don't eat as many potatoes. That's a different cultural viewpoint. Doesn't this in and of itself make it right, much less wrong? But at least there's a reason, there's a grounding for it. So similarly, I think there's a responsibility in advancing any viewpoint to be prepared to explain it, to defend it, and to do your homework, right, before you enable the kind of elite capture. And so I'm kind of pushing us back in some ways, back to more the epistemology side, the truth. What is the truth? Are all values equal? And I would argue, without knowing what those values are, they're not, unless you're prepared to assume the responsibility and advance substantive, data-based, largely rhetorical arguments that support those values. Otherwise, you're surrendering to the elite capture.
Yeah, there's a sense in which I hear the voice of Karl Marx in what you're saying, Steve, which is really interesting. No, I think I think I'm trying to make connections back to Taiwo, who Sterling, as you said, points himself out as a Marxist.
Yeah.
But Marx had the same kind of critique, right? That, yeah, sure, there was this bourgeoisie class in charge of the means of production, but the proletariat could start a revolution and take back the means of production. There's a sense in which the responsibility lies not only on whatever systems of power and the powerful to recognize their responsibility, but the powerless to take it back, to not surrender, in your words.
In that sense, maybe I would have some agreement with Marx, not in a lot of other things.
No. And I didn't mean to, yeah. Who knows? It's not the 1960s, so you don't have to worry too much about a Red Scare, but yeah.
Oh, no, I don't worry about it. I do love his arguments of the fetish of capitalism, but the notion, this kind of comes back to where Sterling pointed us out, the notion that we're all going to be equal and that equates to equality is not necessarily true. I don't equate equality and diversity in the same sense, but it comes back to the point of responsibility. And once there is opportunity, maybe equity is about creating opportunity. Once you have opportunity, then how do you assume responsibility and then use it? And if you don't use it in certain ways, you won't achieve as much as you could. So if I choose to engage, I do Boy Scouts. If I choose to spend a lot of time in Boy Scouts, I probably can't expect to advance in my scientific career as much and necessarily win a Nobel Prize. That's a choice, right? Maybe I'll never win a Nobel Prize, but I can't scream inequity because I don't have a Nobel Prize when I had opportunity and I made certain choices. That's where I assume responsibility and I choose this versus the other. So I think there's a tension there amongst all those different viewpoints. And I keep folding back to responsibility as maybe being in these conversations, but maybe not articulated.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm thinking now about the way that Judge Walker's injunction came about. It's not Walker just took this upon himself. It's that there was a lawsuit brought by lots of people against this legislation, against the state, to which Walker then ruled. So there is a sense in which people said, well, wait a second, maybe I don't have a ton of power, but there's enough of us, and we've all got enough voice that we can say something and let a third party evaluate. And so there's a sense that even in our little local context here with House Bill 7, we're in that same tension between individual responsibility and elite capture, and sort of seeing how that works out in real time. And I think that's going to be really interesting moving forward. I don't know what's going to happen with that ruling or that injunction, or what happens next, but it's something to track. And again, I think thinking about these questions about the relationship between power and rulemaking and politics and things get us thinking about the way that our knowledge and our values sort of intersect or don't sometimes.
Mhm.
A quick thought based off of what I forget the gentleman's name that just spoke. But while he was describing, I'm sorry, this is going to be a little comical. While he was describing the enabling aspect, and then the comment about Marx came up about I'm going to just use commoners being able to overthrow and regain the fruits of their labor, basically. And I was thinking about, so what would be the solution for the House bill? Would it be to just say, you know what, since you guys aren't going to allow us to say certain things, we're just going to go and teach in different states, or we're just going to take our students to other states so that they can learn what we want them to learn? Like, is that really a feasible option for the average Floridian?
Yeah, Mikhail, it's a good question. It seems like, practically speaking, the answer is no, right? It's takes resources and means and other things to be able to just sort of up and leave. But there's also a sense that not everybody wants that. A lot of folks, I think, especially those folks represented as defendants, the other side in this injunction lawsuit, want to fight, right? They think, I mean, I think what's happening is they see their values being, I mean, this is what happens. This is what political conversations are. It's like two sets of competing value claims are being teased out against one another. And the court, the law and the court is in a position of sort of adjudicating those conversations in this really particular, like, legal kind of sense. In the same way that we're having a conversation now, trying to look at various perspectives on this issue, I think the courts are doing the same thing. So I think some people are staying and fighting on both sides of this conversation because they see that they want their values represented at home.
Yeah, it was just interesting to me because I know there are certain people that I'm friends with, associates with, where we definitely have different viewpoints on things that are in a racial sense. But when it comes to, like, them telling me what I can and cannot learn or can and cannot teach, we both have some agreement, like, whoa, you're kind of overstepping your boundaries here. But that's just an observation. Like you said, there are people fighting it. And I think there are people on both sides of the, or different sides of the spectrum, as far as from I think the racial spectrum, what their viewpoints are on certain topics, that see that as more than just, okay, it's about race, but if you tell us we can't do this one thing, then what's to stop you from telling us we can't do something else that has nothing to do with the original reason? Like you said before, when they start using these for different further political agendas further down the road.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mikhail. There's like a slippery slope kind of argument built into this, the worry too, that if you don't fight, then you're the sort of giving up is the, like, absconding of responsibility. And that sort of justifies the other side of the argument. Yeah. Friends, thank you so much for thinking this very messy topic through with me. I know it wasn't as structured as some of our discussions are, but I feel like I got a really clear sense of what was happening and why. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. We will be back again in January on the 31st to talk about water scarcity and access to resources as our next topic. So I think that'll be a shift in gears, but a good one too. In the interim, I hope everybody has a good last couple of weeks of the term and a good break, and stay in touch. If you want to be added to our mailing list, you can reach out to me at Center for Ethics at ucf.edu, and I'll add you to our list.